Hi, and we're back with our second drawing exercise with SolidWorks. So here we still have a fairly simple geometry, but the main premise behind this particular exercise is to show how several simple geometries can work together to create a more complex form. If we look at the geometry in question, we have this base plate, a extruded boss, and a hole. Each one of these fairly simple, but we combine them to make a more complex geometry. Let's take a look at the sketch that underlies, or actually the series of sketches that underlies this geometry. And we'll get the dimensions we need, and then we'll work through actually drawing the object. I've turned on the dimensions for the three features that make up our overall geometry. You can see the base plate itself is 100 millimeters by 200 millimeters. The small boss extrusion in the bottom left corner is 50 millimeters by 40 millimeters. And the hole has a diameter of 25 millimeters and is positioned 30 units away from the top and 35 units away from the left-hand side. So let's get started drawing this object. The first thing you want to do is go to SolidWorks, create a new file. So I'm going to go SolidWorks, File, New, and we're going to create a new part. Part is highlighted, so I can simply hit OK. If you remember, one of the things you always want to do is check your units before you get started. In this case, the default is set to inches, pounds, seconds, and this exercise is in millimeters. So we're going to change our units to millimeter, gram, second, or mmgs. With that set, we'll go ahead and get started. Like everything else in SolidWorks, typically you start with a new sketch. So here I'm going to click the Sketch tab. I'm going to click the Sketch button in the top left corner to initiate the sketch. This particular geometry sits flat on the ground, and I'm going to build that base plate by choosing the top plane. With that top plane selected, I am now ready to begin my sketch. Instead of using 4 lines to make up our base rectangle, I'm simply going to use the rectangle tool. That's located up here in the sketch ribbon in the drawing tools, just below the line tool that we used in exercise 1. Choosing the corner rectangle, you'll notice in the drop-down menu on the left, there's actually several different ways to draw a rectangle. There's the corner rectangle, which is highlighted gray. There's a center rectangle where you click first the center and then an outside corner. And then there are 3 options to create rectangular models or semi-rectangular models in the case of this parallelogram by doing a series of mouse clicks. The numbers here indicate which click is which point. So corner rectangle, first bottom left, then top right. Center starts at the center and then outside corner. And then you can see how these follow suit. In this case, corner rectangle is appropriate. And just like our first exercise, we're going to attach this to the origin point. So I'm simply going to select the origin point as my start point of my rectangle, pull away, and click again for the top right corner. Again, I'm not worried about dimensions. I'm going to add those using the Smart Dimension tool. Rough proportional sketches are all that's really required. Now to add those relationships of dimensions, I'm going to go ahead and invoke the Smart Dimension tool. Choosing the bottom line, I'm going to click and position my first dimension, and I'm going to give this a value of 100 units. And then I'm going to choose the left-hand edge and give this a value of 200 units. You can see automatically that SolidWorks has adjusted my geometry to match those dimensions, and between the relations that exist on the rectangle itself, which gives it these 2 horizontal relations and these 2 vertical relations, those appeared just when we started to create the rectangle itself, and that coincident relationship at the origin point, and 2 dimensions, you'll see now if we look in the bottom right corner, SolidWorks is telling me this model is fully defined. So at this point, I'm done with this sketch of the base plate. I'm going to go ahead and exit the sketch. Making sure that sketch 1 is highlighted, I'm going to click to the Features tab and do a simple extrusion. So I'm going to do that by clicking Extrude Boss Base. And I'm going to give this a blind extrusion of 10 millimeters. That's the default in SolidWorks, so I don't even need to type in a value. I simply need to hit the checkbox. Once that checkbox is hit, my solid now turns a dark gray color, allowing me to understand that it is in fact a solid model. Now we're going to go on and add some additional features to make this a more complex geometry. For me, the next thing I'm going to attack is the boss extrusion here on the bottom left corner. This is a departure now because now we're starting to add features to existing geometry. But it still is based on the same idea of doing sketches. So go up here to the Sketch tab, invoke the Sketch button to start a new sketch. You'll notice, however, that the 3 base planes do not show up. I don't see that top, front, and side view. They are still there, but typically in SolidWorks, after you generate at least one solid, you probably want to have sketches that relate to that in some way. So if we look over here on the left-hand side, SolidWorks is asking us for some information. It's telling me to select a plane or planar face or an edge on which to create that sketch. So now I can go through my drawing and you'll see as my mouse touches different faces, those different faces are highlighted. In this case, I want to draw that rectangular sketch on this top face. So I want to make sure I see that top face be bounded by that orange line all the way around. It is, so I can go ahead and click. And you'll note now that my origin point has moved to the top surface of that. One of the things that I like to do whenever I'm sketching is I like to sketch with that sketch being normal to my monitor surface. So in that case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here to my View Orientation menu, and one of the buttons that you can choose is this Normal To button. You can also get to this by hitting the Control key and the number 8 key. That's a very quick way to do it, and that's one of those keyboard shortcuts that you would use quite often. But here I'm going to choose the Normal To. That's going to make that sketch plane normal to my monitor surface, so I'm not looking at it in kind of an abstracted view. With that set normal to it, I'm going to create another corner rectangle, starting now at the bottom left corner and pulling away. You'll note again we have those same 5 relationships that automatically exist, and I'm simply going to add 2 dimensions. The first one I'm going to add to this top edge, and that is going to be 50 units, or 50 millimeters in this case. And the next one is on the left-hand edge or right-hand edge, and that is going to have a value of 40 millimeters. Simple 2 dimensions. This is now fully defined. We know that because all of the lines, all of the points have turned black. And in the bottom right corner down here, SolidWorks is telling me that is in fact fully defined. I can go ahead and exit this sketch now. You'll see now I have a Boss Extrude 1 over here on my left-hand side, and now I have a Sketch 2. The Boss Extrude 1, if we expand that, includes the sketch of the base plate. Sketch 2 exists on its own because I have yet to make a feature from that. I'm going to make sure that that's highlighted. I'm going to click up here on my Features tab, and I'm going to click Extruded Boss Base. At this point, I'm going to do another blind extrusion, and this time it wants to be 25 millimeters high. So I'm simply going to change the depth distance here to 25 and hit enter. With that being done, I can go ahead and hit the checkbox. I'm going to hold down my scroll wheel and orbit a little bit out of that top plane view so I can in fact show that I've now added a thickness to that sketch that we drew on that original plane. Okay, so now we have to add that hole. That hole is the third and final feature of this object. It's going to be yet a third sketch. So I'm going to come up here to my Sketch tab and initiate a new sketch. And I'm going to come over here to my object, and I'm once again going to select that top surface on which to sketch. I like to draw normal to it, so I'm going to go to my view cube and go to the normal to. And this time up here in my sketch tools, I'm going to choose the circle button. You notice that there are two different types of circles: center, radius, or 3-point circle. Center radius is selected. I'm going to choose a center point somewhere over here on the top left corner, draw a radius, and then I need to add some dimensions. So I go up here to my Smart Dimension tool. This time I can just click the outside edge of the circle, and I'm going to position this and give this a value of 25 millimeters. It's obviously still blue because I haven't shown SolidWorks that where I want this circle positioned within the larger context of my object. So with the dimension tool still active, I'm going to click the edge of the circle and the top edge of my object, and that's going to give me a dimension between the center of the circle and that top edge. This wants to be a value of 30. And I'm going to do that same thing, or similar thing. I'm going to hit the edge of the circle, and I'm going to hit the left-hand edge this time, and I'm going to give this a dimension of 35 units. That's going to position my circle where I want it to be. Once again, good check, make sure that it's fully defined. It is. I'm going to hit escape to get out of that tool. I can double check that all my lines are black, and I can exit the sketch. All right, I'm just going to orbit a little bit out of plane here so we can see what's going on. My sketch 3 is highlighted. Now I'm going to go to features. This time, instead of doing an extrusion, I'm going to do what's called an extruded cut. So one way that I like to think about this is this first set of tools on the left-hand side are additive tools. So this is where we're adding additional clay to our model to build it up. The next group of tools are subtractive tools. So this would be where we would drill a hole through something or cut away something. We're actually using like a tool to get rid of material. So in this case, we have this circle. We want to remove material, so we want to use these subtractive tools here. The next group of tools in the feature tab is all about modifying or duplicating features that already exist. Here I'm going to choose extrude cut. Because that sketch 3 was highlighted, it's going to automatically assume I'm talking about that circle. One of the things you want to think about here is design intent. So what I mean by that is one of the beautiful things, and we'll just spend a few minutes after we get done with this, this extruded cut. One of the beautiful things about SolidWorks is that you can go back in and modify parameters and change the overall form of your geometry. So keeping that in mind, as you start to do things like cuts or extrudes, typically you want to do them in relationship to other objects. So the question I would ask is, this base plate right now is 10 millimeters. So if I choose a blind extrusion of 10 millimeters and hit the check mark, that hole is now cut all the way through. So I can actually rotate my object around, look from the back side. Yep, that hole goes all the way through. The difficulty with this is if I go back and make a change to that base plate thickness, say I realize, oh, I actually want that to be 12 millimeters thick instead of 10, or a manufacturer calls and they say, oh, we're out of 10 millimeter plate, but we have 12 millimeter plate. It's easy for me to change the model to reflect that. So let's go ahead and do that now to this model just as an exercise. So let's say I decide that I want to go back and change my base plate thickness to 12 millimeters. It's very easy for me to do that. The base plate here was my Boss Extrude 1. So here I'm going to right click on top of that. And once I right click when I'm on top of that, the top left icon that shows up here says Edit Feature. If I click on that, that simply brings up that Boss Extrude menu that I had before, and here I can change my value from 10 to 12. I hit Enter, I hit the check mark to select that. The thing that I want you to be aware of here, however, is that once I do that, you'll notice that that hole no longer goes all the way through. So if it was my design intent for that hole to be 10 millimeters deep and only 10 millimeters deep, then I made the right choice. But if my design intent was for that hole to go through the material, there's a much better approach to doing that. So I'm going to go back to my Cut Extrude 1. I'm going to right click on top of that, and I'm going to click Edit Feature. Once I'm in the Edit Feature menu, it simply brings back up that Cut Extrude interface on the left-hand side of my drawing window. And here, where we had previously selected 10 millimeters, there is a better option. So instead of the end condition being blind, I'm going to click on that. And the easiest thing to do in this particular situation would be to choose Through All. What that's going to do is that's going to carry the extrusion in one direction through every body that is behind that drawing plane. If I'm happy with that, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And you'll notice once I do that, that hole now goes all the way through my object once again. No matter how thick that base plate gets, whether it be 10 millimeters thick, 12 millimeters thick, 100 millimeters thick, that hole will continue to go through it. We do have some other options to look at. I'm going to right click back on Cut Extrude 1 and click Edit Feature. And once I do that, it pops our menu back up and we can look at a bunch of different end conditions. Through All Both will go in both directions. So it will extrude cut both below the sketch surface and above the sketch surface. In this case, it doesn't help us at all. Up to Next would absolutely work, as would Up to Surface. I'm going to choose Up to Surface here just to show you what it does. When it does that, it pops up another box that needs additional information. SolidWorks is looking for you to tell it what surface you want to extrude cut up to. So here, now I have to go back to my drawing, rotate around to the bottom surface, hover over that bottom surface, click it to select it. You'll see now face 1 is selected, and I can hit the check mark. This essentially achieves the same thing as the Through All with this particular geometry, and allows us to always have that hole following through as deep as that surface will go. So with that, our object is fully complete. We've done our geometries. We have exactly what we intended to have and set out to draw, so that's great. One last thing I want to show you, and hopefully introduce you a little bit more to the power of SolidWorks as a design tool, is the ability to go ahead and change dimensions or extrusion depths after the fact. So we're just going to take a few seconds here and explore some of the possibilities. Just like we went in and edited the extrusions, we can also go in and edit the original sketch. So if I go to the Boss Extrude 1, which is the base plate of my object, I can go in and change the dimensions of this very easily, and all of the additional features will update based on that. So if I come to Boss Extrude 1, I right click on top of it. Instead of Edit Feature, I'm going to click the icon to the right of that, which is Edit the Sketch. If I do that, you can tell the sketch is open because Exit Sketch button is now active here, and our dimensions show up on the screen. I am going to go normal to my surface just so we can look at this a little bit easier. And the lovely thing about this is I can always go in and make changes after the fact. So if I decide later on, oh, I actually wanted this to be 120 millimeters, I can simply double click on the dimension, put in the value, update it, and let's say I wanted this to be 150 millimeters, I can double click on that and click 150, enter, and the sketch gets updated. This is one of those important times where you have to make sure that you exit the sketch for those changes to take effect. So I'm going to come back up here to my exit sketch button in the top left corner and exit the sketch. And as you can see, the hole and, I mean, very little happened to this because I didn't really change anything in the bottom left corner, but you can see this got wider and the hole got closer to that little boss extrusion. But I didn't have to go back in and edit all of those. This brings up a good conversation about design intent. So if your design intent for the hole is to be a set distance away from this corner, then we're all set. But if your design intent from the hole was for it to be a set distance away from this bottom edge or even from the edge of this extrusion, that's when you want to make sure you dimension from the feature that you want that to follow. Because you'll notice when I made this length shorter, the hole kept the same relationship to that corner because I locked it in there using those dimensions. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into design intent within the context of SolidWorks. And you can also understand how 3 simple sketches can be combined to create a far more complicated geometry. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you on the next exercise.